Hello, I'm Tom Hanchett. I'm a community historian here in Charlotte. And folks have asked me to talk a little bit about planning history in this city based on a book that I wrote. It's called Sorting Out the New South City. Second edition's out from UNC Press. And it looks at how this became a big city, but also how it became a segregated city, not only on the basis of race and ethnicity, but also on the basis of economic background. And we'll mainly look at the 20th century as a background for debates that we're having today. We have moved from the notion that the best city is one that brings people together. Much of the 20th century was spent dividing cities into zones, into separate areas. And today we're kind of moving in the other direction again, pulling us together as a community here in Charlotte. So when we talk about the city, I love to start with Jane Jacobs, who wrote a wonderful book. If you read one book about Charlotte, don't make it mine, make it Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, 1961. Someone who looked very carefully at how cities actually work and had this love of people and bringing people together. Cities have the capability of providing something for everyone, only because and only when they are created by everyone. That's Jane Jacobs, and that hasn't always been the way we went about things, and so that is a useful thing to know. If you're looking for an overview, here we are. We're going to start out talking about the city in the 18th and 19th century, very briefly. But then we're going to really crank up around 1900 when Charlotte was the epicenter of an amazing planning movement of planners from New England, folks that you've heard of, the Olmsted brothers, for instance, did neighborhood plans here. Other folks did as well, creating a new ring of exclusive suburbs around what's now the center city. We did not have a planning department. We didn't get that until 1944. It's important to know that as much as we're talking about the planning history, the planning department is not an all-powerful organization, which some people, they say, well, why'd they build a shopping center there? Bad planning. Well, it's not the planning department. Zoning did come in 1947. Urban renewal in the 1960s, both examples of this trend to sorting out the city, relying on experts for our direction. And then as a backlash against that, the neighborhood movement of the 1970s ushered in today's planning era, where planning is largely community listening, helping people articulate the things that they care about and that they envision for their city. We're going to end up talking about neighborhood change. Charlotte is changing dramatically in the 2010s, 2020s. National real estate prices are rising. We're seeing that here as old line homeowners are often pushed out. Small mom and pop businesses are finding difficulty finding affordable space. And understanding the 20th century backstory will help us better understand where we are today. So let me begin with a map of Mecklenburg County, and this is the Crescent and Wedge map, and it shows a very separated city on the basis of income. Take a look there, and you're looking at the Crescent and the Wedge. Right at the center of town is the center city, and if you go south from there, you're in a wedge of wealth. It may not feel like that if you're there. This is a city where it's very easy to kind of live in your bubble. It's kind of easy to be around people like you, go to work, go to school, go to church, go to the gym, pretty much with people of your zip code. Well, the South Wedge is a collection of very well-to-do zip codes, from the center city to Myers Park to the South Park Mall area to Ballantyne. In contrast, the Crescent across the middle of the county, from the airport over on the left, there's a kind of a blank space. Nobody lives at the airport. Upper middle is Johnson C. Smith University, a historically black college here. On the right is Central Avenue, much less well-to-do. And that is not something that just happened. It's not just the market at work. We'll talk more about that as we roll through the hour here. But you may be aware of a study in 2014 looking at opportunity across 50 metro areas in the United States. And Charlotte, very well-to-do city, came out 50th out of 50 for the ease of folks at the bottom of the economic ladder over the course of a generation or so to work their way to the top. We're not very good at that. And one of the reasons that Raj Chetty, the scholar behind the study, one of the things he pointed out was what he called a spatial mismatch. This is a place where sometimes opportunity is over in that part of town, and the folks who need the opportunity are over here. How do we get ourselves back together? To know that, it helps to know how we got to where we are. So let me start out with the native people, Catawba Indians, who were here before Europeans and Africans got here. Charlotte is about 250 years old, just slightly more than that. But if you look at the spine of Charlotte, Tryon Street, it dates far back. It's a Native American trading path, and it was called the Nations Path. You know, Nations Ford Road. The Nations Ford was a place where that path crossed the Catawba River. Came up from South Carolina, Georgia, up through Charlotte, up through southern Virginia into the area around Richmond. It was a place where if you were trading, you wanted to get back and forth on that line. And so when Europeans came here, they just adopted that as their main street. The colonial governor was a guy named William Tryon. They renamed it for him. But if you look at a map, look at the lower right-hand corner, and you'll see that Tryon Street does not go north-south. It goes at an angle. That's because it follows a ridge line. The ridge line is why we talk about uptown. Charlotte doesn't exactly have a downtown. If you want to call it downtown, that's fine. But the uptown, you really do go up to get to Tryon Street. And around that, you can see the grid of square blocks that were added piecemeal, a few this year, a few next decade, from the 1760s up until the middle of the 19th century. So this is a place that people have created. And to me, that's one essential of planning. Taking a look at how this city's population intermingled is the big surprise. When I was researching the project that became Sorting Out the New South City, I started with this map and one more that you'll see in a moment. This is 1875. Charlotte had been around for more than 100 years. It was still smaller than the current I-277 loop. That meant it was a pretty big city for North Carolina. It had been doubling in size since the 1850s when the railroads came. Despite the Civil War, this was kind of a booming place. It was so big that they split it into 4 election districts, 4 wards. If you look at the top of that map, it says Ward 1. The split was along Trade Street and Tryon Street. So Trade Street, East Trade Street at the bottom, Tryon Street at the left. On the lower left is Trade and Tryon. I just took a quarter of the city. I could handle it. The map had just come out in 1870s, and also a city directory that said who did what and where they lived. I'm an urban historian. I get real excited. So I mash them up. Red pins are businesses. And the businesses were almost all at Trade and Tryon Streets. Big surprise. The blue pins were a surprise. The blue pins are white folks who own their own business. And if you take a look at the bottom of the map, there's a bunch along Trade Street, but actually, they're kind of everywhere. Green pins, white folks who didn't own their own business but had kind of white-collar jobs. Brown pins, white folks who worked with their hands, harness makers, carpenters, people like that. And they're everywhere. There's no wedge of wealth. There's no exclusive neighborhood. Never thought about the term exclusive neighborhood. White pens, people didn't list what they did for a living in the city directory. The yellow pens were the second surprise. Some of the names in city directories back then would have a little C next to them. And the C stood for colored. And, well, I grew up in the South. I figured must have been a black neighborhood in First Ward. I'm in my little bubble, too. I mean, that's the world I was raised in. Imagine my surprise. I start putting in pins. Each of these is one household. Upper right, Brevard Street, there's 6 in the middle. There's about 4 down at the lower left. There's about 5. But actually, African Americans lived on every single block of First Ward 10 years after the Civil War. Wow. Isn't that amazing? And so this notion of a separated city that I grew up in, which I assumed it always been, was something that was created. And we're going to talk in a minute about the kind of disturbing process that created that. But before, let's see. Yeah, there we go. You can actually see this. We've torn down a lot of old buildings in Charlotte, but if you look along College and 7th Street, at the top of that slide, you'll see a blue dot on 7th Street United Presbyterian Church, First United Presbyterian. African American church built in 1896 by its black congregation. And that's pretty cool, coming out of slavery. But what's more amazing, took me a while to grab hold of this, is that if you look over your shoulder, you're looking at Spirit Square, which is now an entertainment facility, but back in the day, it was the white elite First Baptist Church. So you got a black church and a white church, a block apart. If those had been built when I was growing up, they would have been built on opposite sides of Charlotte. So what I'm suggesting is this notion of together or separate. We're kind of at separate right now, or at least we've been in my growing up, but that was not always the case. And it doesn't always have to be the case. So if I was smart, I would quit there. But I told you there was a big change. And the big change, that kind of a hinge in history, happened around 1900. What was going on in 1900? I apologize for showing this slide. This is from what white leaders proudly called the White Supremacy Campaign of 1898-1900. This is not the journalists naming it. This is people who were leading it. And it wasn't Charlotte. It wasn't even North Carolina. Similar things happened all across the South in the mid-late 1890s into the early 1900s. What was going on? Well, what was going on, the background, was an economic downturn, a depression, really bad, early 1890s. And one reaction to a depression, you're losing your job, your business is closing, and it's just not your fault. One reaction of people is to get mad at them, whoever them is. But another possible reaction is to come together in new ways. And that's what happened in North Carolina and other southern states. I don't know if you can see the ballot box there, but it's labeled the fusion. The fusion was black and white voting together. Not all white folks, but many whites and blacks voted together and won both houses of the state legislature. They won the governor's chair. They started to change government to help the little guy, and bam, there was a backlash. How dare you take government out of the hands of the men who own the property and put it in the hands of those who are ignorant and own no property? And that was the mayor of Charlotte. Charlotte Observer, which was very much on the side of the men of property, they were the advertisers. It said it was time to end this rule of Negroes and the lower class of whites. And how do you do that? There's a debate in the Charlotte Observer, and the upshot is white supremacy is the issue. If you can get white folks to vote white, they will vote against their economic interest. And so what you're looking at here is part of a wave of propaganda parades, speeches, newspaper articles, political cartoons aimed at convincing white folks to fear Negro rule, which didn't actually exist. Even in majority black cities, Wilmington was one of them, white people were still in the majority in elected office, but nonetheless, you can see the picture here, Negro rule. It's awful. It's laying waste to our state. He's got his foot on our ballot box. He's reaching out for our women and children. Wow. And it worked. 1900, North Carolina put in place a new constitution. South Carolina did a little bit earlier. Georgia did a little bit later. But they all had the same features. You had to pay to vote. It's called the poll tax. And you had to pass a literacy test. Basically, if the registrar doesn't want you to vote, they say you failed the test. And what this did was to shut down access to government for most black people and a lot of white people. From 1900 all the way to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So a lot of government that was developed in the first half of the 20th century, first two-thirds, profoundly undemocratic. So that's the background for some of this planning that we're going to be talking about. By the way, this is the moment at which segregated train station waiting rooms happen, that African Americans are by law have to sit at the back of the streetcar, later the back of the bus. Down at the courthouse, there are suddenly separate Bibles to swear on in court. Out in the suburbs, this is where it gets into the interesting planning. There are something called deed restrictions. And the deed restrictions, I'll show those to you in a minute, but take a look here at the area that I showed you just already. This is the same area, black and white together, 1875, before the white supremacy campaign. I mapped the same area in 1910. So here's before the white supremacy campaign, here's after. Yellow pins, black folks, blue pins, white folks. Now I want to give you a sense there's just one black neighborhood surrounded by whites. It's really more like a quilt. Black neighborhood, white neighborhood, black neighborhood, white neighborhood. And so the city is sorting out based on this fear. But it's not just something that happens. It is something that is written into the new deeds in the new neighborhoods along the streetcar system. Charlotte, as I said, had only gone about as far out as what's now Interstate 277. In the early 1900s, it sprung a whole halo of streetcar suburbs. And nearly every one of them, this is my neighborhood along the plaza, had restrictions like this. This property shall be used for residential purposes only and shall be occupied and owned by people of the white race only. And take a look down at number 5. Any residence erected on said property shall cost not less than $3,500. It probably $300,000, $400,000 today. And so what you've got is racial segregation and economic segregation written right into the deed. Cities sort out. The notion of an exclusive neighborhood becomes the thing. Some of the neighborhoods were, well, this is kind of cool. This is the Brooklyn area. African Americans frozen out of the new suburbs in the center city, what's today the government center, the Pearl Street Park, NASCAR Hall of Fame, all of that area became a neighborhood known as Brooklyn, a city within a city, created around 1900. It was there until the 1960s. Amazing people lived there. Dr. J.T. Williams was a medical doctor. There's a school named after him. He was also a U.S. diplomat to Sierra Leone in West Africa. His house is at the upper left. Churches, business buildings, the church in the middle, Dr. Williams helped create, that is Grace AME Zion Church. In the distance, the Mecklenburg Investment Company, a black-owned office building, Black Main Street along what's now MLK, Black High School in the center of the neighborhood. and a lot of rental housing. A little less than 10% of African Americans in the early 20th century were able to own their own homes. A lot of them rented. And if you think about it, they can't move out to the burbs. And so they're kind of sitting ducks for investors who build what's called Negro housing, rental housing. That is intentionally, bare bones. And so what you're looking at the left there was what a lot of African American neighborhoods looked like, which took me a while to really understand. I would look at photographs like that and go, well, that must be a bad neighborhood. But actually, the houses haven't been painted, yeah, but it's not the residents who paint the house. And the houses are jammed up right next to each other. The residents don't build the house. Kids are playing in the dirt because there's no sidewalk. The tenants, rental tenants don't build sidewalks. And so what you have is a situation with absentee landlords who are creating this kind of neighborhood, which a good place to live. People who live there talk with love about the role models. Your church was there. Your teacher was there. If you misbehaved as a kid, you got it from your teacher and you got it from folks at home. But for outsiders, looking at a neighborhood like that, it didn't get much respect. So separate black neighborhoods, but also separate white working class neighborhoods. This is NoDa, which is today an arts district, but when it started in 1903, right after the Fusion campaign, it was for blue-collar white folks coming in from the countryside to work in the big textile mills. What's now Heist Brewery was the biggest textile mill in North Carolina for a little while. A whole family would work together, men, women, and children. That's the way it was done that day. And there was a separate downtown, separate churches, a separate community center, the YMCA. And this was very intentional. I found a sermon by a downtown minister who said, just at this point in the development of the mill people, these white working class people, perhaps it is better to let them have their own churches and schools rather than mix promiscuously with the better class. So these kind of set-apart neighborhoods come to define that whole, what's now the inner ring of suburbs. Everything from Plaza Midwood to Myers Park to Dilworth, Wesley Heights, Wilmore, all of those were part of this new era. And the queen of the suburbs was Myers Park. I love Myers Park, helped put it on the National Register of Historic Places, helped write a book about it. Planned by John Nolan, one of the great planners of the early 20th century out of Boston. And planned with nature, with curving streets, greenway parks. They moved in the trees. Beautiful neighborhood. But also, y'all been to Myers Park? You ever been lost in Myers Park? I don't think it's an accident. These new neighborhoods are set apart from the urban grid as exclusive areas. And so by the 19-teens, the city is starting to kind of sort out into us and them neighborhoods. This is not municipal planning. This is private. The landowner contracted with John Nolan, brought him in. Charlotte was a little antsy about government getting involved in planning, but nonetheless, you can see planning going on here. By the way, at the same time that Nolan was doing Myers Park, the Olmsted brothers, sons of the famous Frederick Law Olmsted, were doing Dilworth Road in the midst of the Dilworth neighborhood. So Myers Park, I'd love to talk to you more about moving in the trees and about the way that the landscape began to define that neighborhood and still does today. It became the neighborhood where people like James B. Duke lived, had its own college for white women in the middle, Queen's University. And so this notion of careful planning at the neighborhood level and a love of trees, that's a really important part of who we still are today. Now, Nolan would love to have created a city master plan. City didn't want to go that far. Like I say, there wasn't a planning department. There wasn't a consensus that we needed planning. But this is from Cornell University, from his papers. And this is the draft plan with a ring boulevard, kind of like Queens Road, that would tie together all the neighborhoods. And then, can you see the green? Those are greenways. We're now building them, 100 years later. But that would have knitted together what otherwise was becoming this city of very separate neighborhoods. 1930s, Great Depression, New Deal, and this is when the federal government finally gets a little bit involved in our story. Banks were kind of teetering. We've seen that recently. And so the federal government did these two things to help banks make loans, get the economy moving again in the face of the Great Depression. On the left is something called redlining now. It was originally credit mapping. Sounds pretty innocuous. Somebody in Boston wants to lend money in Charlotte. What if we created a unified mapping system for the United States based on credit risk? And look down at the bottom of the map. The curve there is Queens Road West. Green and blue, that's the best credit. It's Myers Park, Eastover, Dilworth, Elizabeth, Plaza Midwood, the Country Club area. Red and yellow, not so good. And it got the economy moving again, but it stigmatized neighborhoods like, for instance, NoDa. At the top of the map is NoDa. You can see it red and yellow. If you walked into a bank and you had money for a down payment on a house, they saw that you lived in NoDa, you're probably not going to get a mortgage. A lot of absentee landlords end up owning land in places like NoDa. Myers Park, lots of homeowners, and so it builds upon each other. On the right, Federal Housing Administration, which helps banks make the first long-term mortgages, long-term, 20 years, 30 years, brings down the down payment, brings down the monthly payments. But those were not for everybody. This is an FHA document by the economist for the FHA, looking at a study of Chicago that he carried out to determine good and bad ethnic groups. The good groups are the English, the Germans, the Scots, the Irish, Scandinavians. Number 2, North Italians. Number 3, Bohemians. Those are Hungarians, my mom's people. Poles, Lithuanians, Greeks, Russian Jews, the lower class. South Italians, Negroes, Mexicans. Wow. And I'm particularly awake to this because my wife and I recently paid off our house, and we were able to get into that loan because my dad, long ago, gave me a little loan toward the down payment. And yay. But he was English and German. And so his ability to pass on wealth to me, I'm seeing that not everybody had that. This is called intergenerational wealth accumulation. Intergenerational wealth is a big deal because once you start that kind of flywheel going, it has its own momentum, and all you have to do is give it a little bit more of a kick as time goes along, and it spins faster and faster, pulling us apart. So here's the 1930s with the New Deal. And the federal government is with the FHA, they really are encouraging localities now to have a planning department, to have zoning, to have a predictable environment for these new federally insured mortgages. And so one of the things they want is zoning. One of the things they want is planning. And sure enough, in 1944, Charlotte's planning department was started. And in 1947, it created the first zoning map. This is from my book, Sorting Out the New South City. It's off of newspaper microfilm, and then I hand colored it. But if you look at it, you'll see that there is a considerable echo between the redlining map of 1938 on the left and the zoning map of 1947 on the right. Take a look on the right at green, that's single-family zoning, protecting against undesirable influences. The green areas are pretty much in the same part of the city that the racial restrictions had been in, that the redlining had been in. And if you are in, say, Brooklyn, African American neighborhood, look at the redlining map, the entire neighborhood is redlined. Homes, businesses, yeah, a lot of rental housing, but all deemed bad credit risk. On the right, in zoning, it's all yellow, which is industrial, which basically means anything goes. If you're an absentee landlord, you own land in the Brooklyn area, you look at the zoning map, you go, well, I don't think I'm going to paint those houses. I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to keep renting them out. And so the notion of disinvesting in certain neighborhoods, protecting other neighborhoods, kicks that flywheel of segregation even further, racial, ethnic, and economic. A lot of things happening at the federal government that we don't have any control over. In the 1950s, there's a federal tax break called accelerated depreciation, which makes it a tax shelter if you build big new business buildings. And so we get big new shopping centers, and we get big new apartment complexes and office parks and things like that. If you take a look at the top, you'll see the Manor Theater Shopping Center, some of you may remember, on Providence Road in Myers Park, which is about as big as it had gotten, even though people had been driving around in automobiles the majority of Americans had automobiles from the 1920s onward. That shopping center in the 40s, not very big, accelerated depreciation kicks in and you get the Park Road Shopping Center, 1956, and then South Park Mall, Eastland Mall, and all of those places begin even more to pull business energy out to the rim of the city. South Park Mall, located in a very upscale area. Eastland Mall, not quite as upscale, but an area, as we'll see in a minute, that was overwhelmingly white when it was planned. And so the notion of a downtown as a place where everyone comes together gets fragmented by these federal policies in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Then comes urban renewal, one of the great tragedies in American history. Coming out of World War II, there's this belief in experts and planners and highway engineers and people who are going to lead us, just like the generals did in World War II, into a better world. And one of the things that crops up, not just in Charlotte, not just in the U.S., but actually around the world, is the notion that the government will help your town wipe out slums. Something called urban renewal. There's federal money to wipe out slums. Some problems with that. One is that in Charlotte and most other neighborhoods with African American neighborhoods, African Americans are not at the table. The 1965 Voting Rights Act has not happened when this is planned. And a very small percentage of folks get to weigh in on what's going to get demolished. Brooklyn was entirely demolished. Over 1,000 families kicked out. No new housing built in the Brooklyn land area. And 200 businesses displaced, most never reopened. You talk about intergenerational wealth, urban renewal just slices it. And it happens in every American city. Today, that area that was Brooklyn is the area from the Government Center down through the NASCAR Hall of Fame, the Aquatic Center, Pearl Street Park, a vast part of Charlotte that is still today, a lot of parking lots there. Not much going on, though the new Brooklyn Village redevelopment may change that. So by the 70s, you have a very segregated city. Can you see the wedge of wealth there on this map of Charlotte about 1980? The rest of that is the Crescent. Used to be a very strongly black side of town, the west side of town. The east side of town, where I live along Central Avenue, was very white. And by the way, look where the interstate highways ran. wow, every government decision is keying into this imbalance of power that we've been talking about that's been growing over the 20th century. So you have a very sorted out city. But the urban renewal, so heavy-handed, began to spark resistance. Neighborhoods in Charlotte and other places around the United States began to organize in the 1960s and 70s. We're not going to just take at face value what the planning experts, the highway builders say is supposed to happen. We want a say in our community. Neighborhoods organized, the historic preservation movement begins in the late 1960s. The environmental review that we now take for granted, a new thing in the 1970s. Here in Charlotte, the neighborhood movement on the west side, on the east side, so strong that they change the way we elect our elected representatives. Used to be everybody was elected at large, which meant you had to be well-to-do, you had to be well-connected, be able to run a county-wide or a city-wide campaign. 1975, they switched to a combination of districts and at-large, like we have now, which allows many more voices. Harvey Gantt becomes the first black mayor in the 1980s as a result of this. Sue Myrick, the first female mayor, a very conservative person. So it's not a liberal conservative thing, it's a giving honor to the voices of our neighborhoods. And out of that, you begin to see change. At the national level, the civil rights movement is bubbling. Martin Luther King's last big success as he was assassinated was working through Congress the U.S. Fair Housing Act. In 1968, it says you cannot set aside a particular part of the city for what they used to call Negro dwellings, which, because it was set apart, could be developed in a substandard way. You cannot do that. And the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act says lenders must lend in all neighborhoods. You cannot redline particular areas. I can see the impact in my part of Charlotte. East Charlotte in 1960 was 99% white, neighborhoods along Central Avenue. By the time I got here in the early 80s, it was about 25% black, and it still is today. East Charlotte now looks like Charlotte. And so this is, I hope, an empowering thought. Today we're often distressed. We're often depressed that nothing's ever going to change. Yes, it is. It can. It has. Some big efforts like the Fair Housing Act and the Community Reinvestment Act made a big change. And you can see it in the city itself. If you take a look on the left, that's the 1980 map. On the right is a 2010 map. This, again, is the Crescent and Wedge map that we talked about before. They're the same scale. And so right in the middle of that map is the old pattern, the Crescent and Wedge. But look out towards the edges and you'll see a completely different pattern. This is a result of those big federal changes in the 60s and 70s. As we've built new parts of Charlotte since the 70s, we have built in a way that is much more mixed. When I came to Charlotte, people said, don't go west. And today, the hottest real estate market in North Carolina is Steel Creek, which is southwest of the city. And it is full of every different kind of person, every different kind of land use. Same deal if you look all the way around the edge here, look at the upper right, and you're looking at University City, the Mallard Creek area near the big shopping mall, the big outlet shopping mall, Concord Mills. And there's just a lot more excitement in all parts of the periphery of the city than there was when I came here in the 1980s and people said, don't go west. So that's economic change. Let me talk about racial change. Race today compared with 1980, big changes, particularly in my part of Charlotte. Over on the right-hand side of the map, the east side, Central Avenue, Albemarle Road, used to be almost entirely white. Now it looks like Charlotte. Black pockets, white pockets, integrated pockets. Same thing, lower left, look at Steel Creek. Black pockets, white pockets, integrated pockets. Same thing in the upper right, where 485 was just being completed when this map was drawn. And so we're much more mixed than we were when I was a young person in Charlotte. Change does happen. Sometimes the change comes from new folks, and we are a city that is growing very quickly. Mecklenburg County had 500,000 people in 1990. It has 1 million today. In 1990, it had almost no immigrants. Today, someplace between 15 and 20% of us are immigrants from all over the world. If you look at the orange bloops on the map there, those are areas that are heavily foreign-born. Central Avenue, yep. South Boulevard, yep. Ballantyne, yep. Upper right, that is the Mallard Creek University City area, one of the most diverse parts of Charlotte. And so change can happen, change is happening. And what I'm seeing, and looking particularly at immigrants, is not a Chinatown or a Little Italy or the Latino barrio. I'm seeing a salad bowl. It's a new dish, but you can taste all of the individual flavors. The European grocery store, the Vietnamese banh mi cafe, those are submarine sandwiches, the halal meat market, the Cambodian video store next to the Salvadoran diner. Wow. This is a place that is so different from what I grew up in the South. I grew up in the world where each race had its own water fountain. How many water fountains would we need for this? Things do change. And sometimes the changes happen most robustly in humble neighborhoods. What we're looking at here is something called NoDa, naturally occurring affordable housing. Housing, we'll talk in a minute about how housing has become a big issue here. But this is not public housing. This is not subsidized housing. This is naturally occurring affordable housing. Different economic levels all together in the same neighborhood. Pretty cool? I think so. It's where I live. But it is also an area where, even though it's an old shopping strip, doesn't look fancy, is an area that has entrepreneurs building new businesses. Entrepreneurs from every corner of the earth in a single shopping center. There are a number of these around Charlotte. This particular one on Central Avenue has a Mexican tienda. It has the Salvadoran restaurant at the upper right, Cedarland, folks from Lebanon at the lower right, Vietnamese soup parlor, 2 women from Somalia in Africa. And so this is our new Charlotte. Some of it expressly planned. Some of it is, these are the voices that planners are now listening to, trying to work with as we build a vibrant city. Amazing, go down Central Avenue. I don't know if you can see this on your screen, but Central Avenue is in across the top of the map there, about a little bit above the middle. And as you come out from the center city, there's an area of blue dots. This is from about 2009. Predominantly African-American neighborhood of Belmont. Then you cross over Hawthorne Lane and a lot of green dots. It's a predominantly white neighborhood of Plaza Midwood. But then you go a little bit further out and the dots are every possible color. And take a look at the census tracts out along Central Avenue towards Eastway. Still more white folks than anybody else. Native-born black folks, often the second largest number. But we have people now from all over the world intermingling in some of our neighborhoods today. This separated city that I grew up believing was always the case, wasn't always the case, and is not the case now in some parts of Charlotte. City has grown fast. We are no longer a majority white city. Haven't been since before the 2010 census. Has not affected the desirability of this community at all. And so as people plan today, there are many voices, there are many new voices that are coming together to shape our community. Which brings me to the big issue that's probably been on your mind as you picked up this video. neighborhood change. Some folks call it gentrification. That has a ring to it that it is white replacing black, and there's certainly a lot of that going on. I'll talk about why in a minute. But what I'm seeing is that it's happening in every neighborhood. People with money and choice are relocating towards center city neighborhoods. Old houses are being bulldozed, new houses are being built. Old apartment complexes, which were NOAA, nationally occurring affordable housing, are no longer affordable. It's kind of scary if you're a renter. And that issue is exacerbated by generational wealth. If you don't have much generational wealth, you're probably a renter. If you have that money passed down through your family, as I was lucky to, you qualify for a loan. We've had very low interest rates nationally from 2008 all the way into the early 2020s. They're now raising somewhat. But those artificially low interest rates have been very good for people who can take out a home loan, refinance their house, put together a leveraged deal, create a real estate syndicate that uses borrowed money. Tremendous changes. And it's been, for most of us who own, kind of a good time. But 40% of us are renters. And for those folks, this is a very tough time. Take a look at the most recent revaluation map on the left. This was a draft in January of 2023. And look at the areas where real estate prices have gone up most dramatically. Does it look like the Crescent? Yep. And I don't know exactly what the connection is, but as it becomes harder to rent, we're seeing more folks without homes. And so the bad news is that this situation where some neighborhoods have a lot of intergenerational wealth, some don't, is etched deep into our history. It did not just happen. That's the bad news, but the good news is that the situation we're in now, whatever it is, was created. It's not God-given. It's not the way the market has to work. People have created our city. We are people. We can create something different if we want to. One last slide. A bunch of other people are talking about this. Sorting Out the New South City, I recommend the second edition of that. I don't get any royalties. It's very affordable. The New York Times bestseller, The Color of Law, extremely well written. I recommend that. There are a number of histories of particular aspects of Charlotte. There's a new one out, Legacy 3 Century of Charlotte's Black History. I mentioned the classic by Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. That white supremacy campaign actually came to a military coup in Wilmington, won the Pulitzer Prize, the history of that. Talking about salad bowl suburbs, talking about urban renewal. Dig into Charlotte. And if you like, check out my website, which is www.historysouth.org. I'm Tom Hanchett. I'm really grateful to the folks at the Planning Academy here in Charlotte for giving me this opportunity.